800 million euros in these projects. And just a few examples, we can look at Euromed Justice or Euromed Police, which cover the police and judicial cooperation with the southern neighborhood. And of course, we have the development assistance and also support during the COVID-19. And this support, I think in the past almost 2 years, there are over 0.3 billion euros, if I recall correctly, towards the countries of the southern neighborhood. And then, of course, there's also the bilateral projects that the EU develops with countries from the Middle East and North Africa. And this project covers topics such as economic growth, institution building, anti-money laundering, countering the funding of terrorists. Then, of course, civil protection, which is also very important, as we'll see later, border security, aviation security, and there are many examples where the EU helped Middle East and North Africa countries. Well, what these activities outline? They, of course, outline an exchange of know-how the EU gives to the Middle East and North Africa countries. There are some lessons learned that the EU draws back and also makes the EU a trustworthy partner. Moving on to the second point, it outlines the areas where the EU could be more influential. And here I would look at maybe the challenges and opportunities that the region faces. And here the first one I would say is climate change, without a doubt. We see the temperature rising in the region, we see droughts, we see issues of water scarcity, we see the potential for natural disasters, we see a reduced food supply. Many of the countries in the region, they import a big amount of their food, so any disruption in the supply chain would affect them, or already has. And also, in addition to this, I would look at the digitalization of the region, which is advancing very rapidly. The COVID-19 has also enhanced this process, and also with this digitalization process, we see a growing number of cyber threats in the region. In terms of opportunities, I would look at energy transition. The region has an immense potential for renewable energy, and I'm talking about solar potential, also wind potential, and here the EU could enhance its cooperation as outlined in the next point. And third, I would outline the maritime issues in the regions. We have like a high amount of traffic, there is a big important amount of supply chain passing through the region where the EU could be more influential. Moving on to the third point, which I'll focus here, how the EU can operationalize these aspects. Where one of them is the new agenda for the Mediterranean that the EU launched in February this year. And it outlines a few priorities in the next years in growth, business, investments, green transition, and digital transition. Of course, it's important to follow in the next year the implementation in this regard. Then we have the EU cybersecurity strategy, which outlines how important it is to establish partnerships with different actors across the world. And the Middle East and North Africa, it's an important part of this external cooperation. Then going back to the energy transition, the EU has developed the EU Green Deal, which doesn't have yet an external dimension, but there is a lot of potential to develop this external dimension and look at how the EU and the Middle East and North Africa could cooperate in this energy transition. Then third, there is the maritime presence. The EU is already present in the Strait of Hormuz. There's the mission, the EMASOC, but there is potential to have more presence in the region. And I think it's important for the EU to develop more tools to be present from a maritime point of view. And fourth, I would look at the EU Gulf relations. We have had recently the visit of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs in the region. His trip was to reinforce ties. And among the points in this trip, of course, renewable energy, because the renewable energy produced by the Gulf will need a market. And of course, they would look at the EU as an immediate client. Of course, water security, civil protection cooperation, maritime safety, nuclear safety, and also the possibility to relaunch discussions on a EU GCC free trade agreement, which are currently stuck or have been for quite a few years. And last, another tool of the EU is the EU Global Gateway. I think it was mentioned today also in some of the introductory remarks of the conference. It's a new tool that was just launched, I think around 300 billion for the next 5 years, if I recall correctly. And its aim is to support developing infrastructure in the developing world, which also includes the Middle East and North Africa region. And I think it's important to follow also in these developments. Now, before moving to the last point, I would say that this operation in all these areas could act as confidence building measures. And by building this confidence, then the EU could become more influential in more important from a political and security point of view issues. Now, last point, issues to follow in the next year and also beyond that I think that are very important. Just a bit zooming out a bit on the region, and I think there are like a couple of points. One would be the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, especially Red Sea. This would grow in importance in the following years, and I think it's important for the EU to adapt and understand what this development means from a trade, security, and economic point of view. Then there is the EU potential role in the reconfigurations that happen in the region. We have seen in the past year or two, I've seen warming relations between countries that have previously been at odds with each other. We've seen, of course, Iran and the Gulf, we see the Gulf and Turkey, we see Turkey and Egypt, and I think it's important for the EU to be present in these discussions and to have an active role. Then we have the East Mediterranean geopolitical competition. This will grow without a doubt in the next years, and the EU needs probably to develop a strategy and also some actions towards the region. Then I would look also at the spillover from Sahel towards North Africa. I think it's important to look at Sahel also from the prism of the lessons learned from Afghanistan. There are many similarities, and I think it's important for the EU to look at the region through the lenses of the lessons that we learned from Afghanistan. And of course, the lessons learned from Afghanistan are also important for the future EU interaction with the region. And the last point would be the French EU presidency next year. The French are starting to become more prominent in the region, and it's important to follow how will this develop in the next year. And I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Yes, we have not to stop. We have to continue the discussion because it's a topic, a sensitive one. The role, the chance of European Union in cooperation with the MENA region. So the next speaker, Professor Marius Naxu, University of Economic Studies in Bucharest. He is leader of a very representative course on geopolitics, launching also a book recently about the topics of geopolitics, and we are very pleased that he is now with us. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you. If all the technical aspects are right, if you hear me and see my slides.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to congratulate you for your resistance and resilience, and also all the participants and your co-chairman. I have to confess here, there was a marathon, an academic and also a diplomatical marathon, which is the first time when I participate, when I join such a professional marathon. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Marius Naxu, and I am associate professor within the Bucharest Academy of Economic Studies, and I coordinate MA, a master program in geopolitics and business. And my presentation will be a little bit broader than the issue of the panel, and it is about perspective regarding of these 30 years since the end of the Cold War, and how the world is changing. I'm interested in I'm interested in the instrument that has been used and the context, because this is important. This is I'm analyzing for many years, and it's important to me to emphasize that this dynamics of geopolitical frontier between the Western world, and when I say Western world, I refer to the NATO and the European Union and Russia. Everything is happening in this region are consequences, are effects on these dynamics of this geopolitical frontier. Also, we have new actors. We face with new space race, with strange, bizarre actors who believed a few years ago that Arab state could become space actors. Also, there is another environment for geopolitics, and also became a geopolitical weapon, the cyberspace. So, synthesizing this, we have a changing world, and we need new instruments, new tools for understanding. So, from my point of view, there are at least 3 instruments that has been used, especially by Russia, for solving this dynamics of geopolitical frontier between Western world and Russia. A frozen conflict, and Russia knows how to export the geopolitical model of Transnistria as a frozen conflict. Hard energy, another term, another specialized term, energetic, with the K at the last word, the last letter, or hard energy, gas, natural gas versus geopolitical concessions. And also, I used here another, probably a strange word, Euro intifada. What is happening with those human bombs as the Polish-Belarus border, it's a sort of Euro intifada. Refugees and migrants are used as a geopolitical tool. Regarding the first instrument, Russia used this frozen conflicts in order to step in the first stage for breaking the ongoing geopolitical trends. And those geopolitical trends were the extension, the march to the east of the NATO and European Union. Then this instrument was used by Russia to create artificial geopolitical tension. If we look at the maps, all these frozen conflicts are located on this frontier, on this geopolitical frontier between Russia and the Western world. A frontier, it is not a political border. A frontier, a geopolitical frontier is a sort of buffer zone. It's a sort of buffer zone, and we have here some terms. From my point of view, the geopolitical Transnistria, I already said that Transnistria became a model of the evolution of all frozen conflict of the area, is a region of high geostrategic significance used by Russia for stabilizing the geopolitical frontier on Baltic Black Sea alignment. A century ago, a Romanian geographer, Simeon Mehedinți, in a conference like ours, tried to establish that the border between Asia, the geographical border between Asia and Europe, must be on this alignment, Baltic Sea and Black Sea. If we observe the phenomenology today, the currently phenomenology is in the same place, on this alignment between Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. The second instrument was about energy. Hard energy is a translation from hard power to hard energy, but the army invasion was replaced with locking the gas pipeline. First was a gas war between Ukraine and Russia in the 2000 years. And this gas war stimulated another conflict, regarding the gas pipelines. And Russia used what we can call preemptive gas pipeline. If George Bush Jr. used the term preemptive war, sometimes translating in a wrong translation in Romanian as preventive war. Mr. Vladimir Putin, the President Vladimir Putin, used another concept, and this is preemptive gas pipeline. He launched some project blocked in the western front. If we look at the reality nowadays, we have an energy pincer. We have 4 gas pipeline under the Baltic Sea. We have the gas pipeline under the Black Sea, and the reality was a Russian reality, an energy pincer which catch Europe. The third instrument and the last instrument, chronologically speaking, is this new geopolitical tool, the use of refugees and emigrants. We easily can observe that we are in the same place, in the same location, on the geopolitical frontier between Western world and Russia, between NATO and European Union and Russia. After 30 years, it seems we return back to the walls and fences, and there are some fences, physical walls rising between Western and Russia. This is another interesting term, economic refugees. We all know that immigrants has economical purpose. We all know that refugees has political purpose, but we face another concept, refugees, where the push factor is political, from Syria, from Iraq, and another war zone, but they choose where to go. They have economical reasons. They all have to get in Germany, for an example. This is a map which shows the population growth and the difference between southern world and the northern world. It looks like thermodynamical equilibrium. The northern world is demographically aging, and most of the people came from the southern world, from the emerging economies. If we look at the 2020 and 21 refugees, they come from Iraq, mostly, Afghanistan, and Syria. Why Belarus? Because that's why I explain, this is not about the simple migration route. This is about the geopolitical instrument. They were brought here with the national airlines company to put pressure on European Union border. Okay, yeah. A new kids on the block, tourism in Belarus. They also share the location. They all came in the same spot, and that means we have another we have the hybrid conflict. We have the informational component. Well, in another presentation, if we consider the Belt and Road Initiative, is this another pincer on Eurasia? This is a question, a further question, an open question, which could affect the relation between European Union and MENA. And another question, is there a synchronizing between Russia and China? The pressure on European geopolitical frontier and the pressure on Taiwan, also in South and East China Sea. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, and we have the chance to collect some ideas for discussions for this last part of our webinar. And now let's introduce Dr. Alexandru Georgescu, strategic analyst, Eurodefense Romania. He is known for his studies, articles, and also books. He's working on research with ICI Institute, but also publishing and working in Brussels with different working groups of European Defense Agency, European Space Agency. So maybe you can bring also the perspective from above, Mr. Georgescu. Thank you so much. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here, and I'd like to congratulate the organizers for such a long-running effort that really puts Romania on the map when it comes to Middle Eastern studies and exchanges of ideas. I have a presentation. I will share my screen now. So I would like to continue a bit in the registry of what my predecessors discussed by approaching the issue of the European contribution to Middle East, North Africa security from the perspective of critical infrastructure protection. 1 second. Can you see my screen? And is it moving?
Yes, it's okay.
Yes. Perfect. So I'd like to discuss a critical infrastructure perspective on EU assistance to the MENA region. So MENA has very different issues that can be approached also from a critical infrastructure perspective. New dimensions of competition and power games, too many competing and conflicting narratives, sub-regional and trans-regional dimensions. We can't seem to agree whether it is a border region, for instance, the North Africa between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa, or is it a buffer region, or is it a bridge? And also significant differences resulting from various issues, including attempted block building. Now, critical infrastructure protection provides us an overview of an issue that is vital to the functioning of all societies, especially advanced societies: energy, transport, agriculture, health. And this provides us a systemic perspective that allows us to analyze both the security environment and also to increase resilience, to increase the protection of those societies. So regional and global infrastructures present special challenges, and the MENA area is one such region because it is crisscrossed by global critical infrastructures and also by future projects. And these infrastructures suffer from risks, vulnerabilities, and threats, including cascading disruptions. And the greater dependence on critical infrastructures leads to mutual dependencies and new risks, vulnerabilities, and threats. The EU is dependent on critical infrastructures which originate or pass through the Middle East and North Africa region. And this automatically means that it is affected by the propagation of risks stemming from the region. So critical infrastructure protection is a framework which has been first developed in the United States during the Clinton administration, applied after the 9/11 attacks, which showed that the interdependencies between critical infrastructures can affect not just the site of a terrorist attack, but also the wider society. So they applied this. Then it was applied by the European Union, starting with 2004, but actually the first directive was in 2008. And it states that a country is only as safe and as prosperous as its infrastructures will allow. And it provides us a comprehensive framework for managing the key infrastructures, assets, and resources on which countries depend at all levels. For instance, Professor Mureșan was kind enough to mention some of my activities. I am a moderator for a working group on the protection of critical energy infrastructures within a consultation forum of the European Defense Agency. So the protection of critical infrastructures is a very important topic at European level. And the purpose of my presentation today is to show that the European Union can provide assistance to the Middle East, North African countries on critical infrastructure issues, and that this framework can address various issues affecting the region, not all of them, of course. It is not a silver bullet for the region. Global networks have become sources of critical systemic threats through domino effects in critical infrastructures, through pandemic spread, through rapid travel and transportation hubs. So predictability and controllability are important, and to promote resilience through backup standards, interaction between stakeholders. And of course, the region, while it is a very varied region, the Middle East, North Africa region also features important transport hubs. So it is affected by a wide range of critical infrastructure issues, or issues such as pandemics, which can also be reduced to critical infrastructure issues. We have seen recently the issue of supply chain risk. And the Middle East, North Africa region is also affected by supply chain risk, lately seen in the pandemic issue and in the context of the fight against the coronavirus pandemic with the vaccines and the important materials, but also seen in other regards. So supply chains face a combination of risks. We are facing infrastructure development. This is very good. And the past panelists mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, which will shorten transport times, but increased geographical distance raises new challenges to manage supply chain flows, such as disruption risks and sustainability risks. And risks include unsustainable supply management for emergencies, lack of risk and liability management, unbalanced risks, lack of transparency, and so on. The pandemic highlighted the vulnerability of long logistics chains. And so first you have cuts in the chain, and then the inability to keep up with demand. So the MENA region has various critical infrastructure protection priorities. I don't think that this is an exhaustive list. So it needs to have infrastructure security and resilience. It needs to manage risk perceptions and confidence in the authorities. It needs to promote and protect new strategic infrastructure in a challenging environment. It needs to generate business continuity during crisis and also maintain quality of life, or improve quality of life, of course. It needs to establish proper regional interconnectors and to manage successful digital transitions. Of course, you can add your own issues here. There are some MENA countries that are heavily dependent on oil revenues, and they need to diversify their economies to increase their complexity, to produce more added value. And this is, again, a critical infrastructure issue. So what are the infrastructure concerns in the area? First, there is no true institutionalized security architecture, although there are attempts at smaller levels like the Gulf Cooperation Council. You have problems with risk perceptions in the area. You have persistent conflict and uncertainty, aging and attrition in the existing infrastructure, and of course, conflicts related to infrastructure. You have a complexity of existing infrastructures, uneven and unsecured digitalization, geopolitical conflict, and also it is a site for strategic infrastructure development, as the aforementioned Belt and Road Initiative. But we can also mention other initiatives that are not necessarily in the media, such as the North-South Transport Corridor, which is supposed to pass through Iran between India and Russia. That is also an example. So what should we take into account? Tangibles and intangibles, long-term interdependencies, key assets, key resources, and perceptions, including perceptions of risk. So what could the EU contribute to this? As mentioned before, the EU has developed a quite extensive system, not only to protect critical infrastructures at national level, which is of course mainly the responsibility of the individual states, but it emits recommendations in that regard, but also to protect the European critical infrastructures on which 2 or more member states are dependent. So the EU has a lot of knowledge about this issue and also has a lot of knowledge on multilateral cooperation for critical infrastructure protection. So firstly, I would state that there could be support from the EU or for individual countries from the EU, just like Romania, to implement critical infrastructure protection in the MENA region. And together with Professor Mureșan and with Flavius, over time, we have advanced quite a number of proposals related to the transfer of Romanian expertise in critical infrastructure protection from Romania, from Romanian universities and Romanian think tanks and NGOs and associations to beneficiaries in the Middle East. Romania has had a very successful application of the European directives in this regard, and some of the actions with which countries such as Romania can assist include the assistance for the drafting of documents of reference in critical infrastructure, protection, assistance in setting up continuing education programs for experts and decision makers. Knowledge is important, of course. Contacts for knowledge transfers between counterpart institutions. Cooperation for setting up bodies such as interinstitutional working groups, technical secretariats, crisis and emergency management centers, and so on. And also cooperation in the non-governmental spheres. For instance, you could have a national critical infrastructure and service protection associations for experts and companies. This is an important component. A second contribution the EU and its countries could make, but especially the EU, would be to expand the European Program for Critical Infrastructure Protection to encompass non-EU countries in the MENA region. Right now, the EPCHIP program basically applies to member states, and it states that a European critical infrastructure affects 2 or more member states. But there are also European critical infrastructures with a component outside the territory of the EU. So it is important, it is a possible vector to have a cooperation with these third countries, whether they are in the east of Europe or in the south of Europe or in the southeast of Europe, to cooperate with them, to transfer know-how, and to also include them in this management of the critical infrastructures on which Europe itself is reliant. You'll notice that I am speaking here not just of the interest of the countries in the MENA region, but also the self-interest of the EU in promoting the resilience of critical infrastructures on which it is now dependent and will also be dependent in the future. And this would involve, this type of cooperation would involve helping them identify these infrastructures, helping them create a regulatory and administrative framework to protect them, transferring knowledge, a lot of the components mentioned before, but also national contact points, security liaison officers, appropriate exchange of information during crises. All of these are very important. And there are even infrastructures in this regard, such as the critical infrastructure early warning network, information network that the EU has set up, which could be extended to MENA countries. And we can see that now, in the beginning, the European Critical Infrastructure Protection Program only involved energy and transport. But starting in December 2020, there have been new proposals, which have not yet been implemented, that recognize that there are more interdependencies, there are more types of critical infrastructures which have a trans-regional, trans-border effect. So it is now going to implement something related to, maybe in this variant or another variant, the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, which also includes health, financial market infrastructure, drinking water, digital infrastructure, public administration. So all of these are potential areas for cooperation on critical infrastructures between the EU and the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. Basically, my first proposal was related to the various infrastructures that could be detected at national levels in these countries, but also a proposal, the second proposal, to include, when it comes to transborder infrastructure, to include the governance of the security of these infrastructures in the European program. And my third and last proposal is to initiate a Mediterranean macro-regional strategy for the EU. Macro-regions are a new level of governance in the EU that rely on functional areas defined by geography, by common challenges, by existing industrial chains, by existing history, and so on, to address common challenges. And they include not only European countries, but also non-EU countries. And this sort of arrangement has proven successful in the past with regards, for instance, to the European Union Baltic strategy. I think that the Mediterranean macro-regional strategy, or maybe a variant like a West Mediterranean strategy and an East Mediterranean strategy, in which EU countries can cooperate directly with non-EU countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, could have a significant benefit in terms of channeling and arranging EU efforts in the region to improve security for all, and also to improve cooperation on economics, environmental protection, and other issues. So this is an example, the Danube Strategy, which was initiated by Romania and Austria. It includes not only European Union countries, but also non-EU countries. For instance, Croatia was not in the EU when the Danube Strategy was first announced. And it includes also Balkan countries, the Republic of Moldova, and parts of Ukraine. Why? Because it's related to the catchment area of the Danube River. Now, such a model could also be applied in the West Mediterranean or the East Mediterranean or the whole Mediterranean. And you can see the pillars of existing strategies: connecting the region, so mobility and multimodality, sustainable energy, culture and tourism, people to people, protecting the environment, building prosperity, and also strengthening the region where an infrastructure protection element could be introduced. So, and the EU already has experience in this macro-regional cooperation. Not all of the elements have functioned so far. The Baltic strategy was a much greater success than the Danube strategy, for instance. But I think this is a model which the European Union could use to organize its influence, to organize its efforts in the region. So in lieu of conclusions, I would like to summarize this way. Firstly, we need to look at a lot of the problems in the MENA region as being critical infrastructure problems related either to health, energy, public administration, and so on. The EU can offer direct assistance in this regard for the protection of critical infrastructures, which are a target for hybrid threats. And it can, during this presentation, I also advanced 3 proposals, concrete proposals for how the EU and member states such as Romania could assist countries in the MENA region to implement critical infrastructure protection programs, not only to their benefits, but to the direct benefit of the EU as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now we having the maps and this clear presentations, ideas. These are also invitation for the final discussion. We have a last speaker from our session, which is our colleague Professor Sergiu Dur.
No, Doctor.
Is the candidate Sergiu Dur from University Babeș from Cluj.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mureșan. It's a great pleasure for me to take part in this event. I'm going to talk about the European Union's foreign policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The main idea of my presentation is that in the last couple of years, EU failed in contributing proactively to the revival of the Middle East peace process because of its strategic paralysis regarding this issue and its obsession with the out-of-date Oslo paradigm. As a consequence, EU needs a new approach in relation to this conflict. These are the 3 main points I'm going to tackle in my presentation. The first one, the root causes of EU strategic passivity or paralysis. We have two causes. Lack of unity is the first of them. EU member states hardly speak on a single voice when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this issue divided EU in 3 camps. We have a pro-Israeli camp formed mainly around Hungary and Poland. We have a pro-Palestinian camp, which includes Sweden, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And we have a relatively neutral camp formed around France. Moreover, Israel undermines EU consensus by engaging with individual states rather than with EU as a single entity. And Israel benefits from its close relationship it has with the 4 Central European states that make up the Visegrad group, and I mean Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Poland. These internal divisions tie EU's hands because in the foreign affairs field, EU expresses and adopts positions mainly based on consensus, and these divisions limits EU's credibility and capacity to act, and they represent an opportunity for the Israeli and Palestinian lobby groups. The second cause here is that EU is more comfortable with allowing US to lead the diplomatic initiatives regarding this issue, and also EU has little to say in other international formats, like, for example, like the Middle East Quartet or the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee. So because of this self-imposed secondary role and its lack of unity, EU is unable to use sanctions leverage against Israel for violating international law. Also, EU lacks political will to constrain the Palestinian leaders to act in accordance with democracy and the rule of law. In fact, in the last years, the Palestinian elite ignored EU calls for democracy, rule of law, and accountability. And the truth is, the truth is that in the EU became, after the so-called Arab Spring, EU became more risk-averse and reserved in demanding structural reforms. And since then, EU is more concerned with stability and countering the rise of Islamist groups than in good governance. Second point of my presentation, another shortcoming of the EU approach is that EU is stuck in the logic of the Oslo Accords. The cornerstone of EU policy are the Palestinian rights to self-determination and the negotiated two-state solution. The problem is that EU promotes these objectives through the Oslo Agreement's paradigm, but the reality on the ground shows us that this approach is out of date. Why? Because it failed to freeze the status quo, and in the last 2 decades, Israeli settlements and infrastructure connecting them spurred, which will lead to a future fragmented Palestinian state. This Oslo paradigm also led to an absolute Israeli control over Palestinian life. On the other side, there is another obstacle for the United Palestine, which is this rivalry between Hamas and Fatah. Having this in mind, EU should realize that its 3 main objectives, like peacemaking, two-state solution, and peace state building, are out of reach in the near future. As a consequence, EU should ramp up its efforts to devise a new paradigm. And European scholars and experts on this issue called on the EU to rethink its approach in accordance with the current realities on the ground. And they have proposed an approach based on the following 5 lines. The first one, discouraging Israel for building new settlements in West Bank by using economic and political tools, insisting for direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for a two-state solution. EU observers and scholars on this issue have argued that EU should give Israeli decision makers a choice to commit to negotiations for a two-state solution or to give to the Palestinian people equal rights in one democratic state. Regarding the Palestinian leaders, EU should give them a choice to implement reforms in the line with democratic rule of law and good governance principles, or losing US economic, political, and diplomatic support. EU also should take efforts to bridge the gap between all Palestinian political factions. Point number 4, EU should try to become an equal partner to the US in this matter. And the last point, EU should engage with the Arab world with realistic expectations. The European Union should be realistic and recognize that the Abraham Accord will not bring dividends for the Palestinian cause, and this normalization and formalization of the relations between Israel and the 4 Arab states happened last year, did not lead to any progress, neither to the peace progress nor to the Palestinian lives. And these normalizations confirm that the Palestinian issue is no more a driving force in the region, because it broke a long-standing taboo in the Arab world. This was that the Arab states will recognize Israel in return for making meaningful political compromises vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And basically the last point, European Union should have this aspect in mind when engaging with regional actors on this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward hearing your questions and comments in the Q&A session.
I wish you all the success in your studies, and yes, it's right. Palestinian topic deserve a special discussion. Always it's difficult in some minutes to tackle such a sensitive issue. But in any case, it's good that we had in our broad view also this topic. Now I'm here very pleased that I see also Minister Severin. We have other people which I'm sure our guests which want to make some comments, to answer to some questions. We had here a lot of problems. We raised a lot of problems here by the foreign guests and also by the Romanian speakers. So what we can do in the European Union with the MENA region, we have this very sensitive now topic of migrants, and it's not only like Professor Nakshi mentioned by Belarus. It's a third direction for these migrants coming to Europe or be pushed to Europe. We had first from Turkey towards Greece and Central Europe to Western Europe. Then we had now the couloir from south, from northern part of Africa. That means Libya mainly, going toward Italy and so on. And now we have the third couloir, which is under negotiation to find a humanitarian solution for this new reality. So please, who wants to take the floor? Minister Severin, I have seen you in a certain moment.
He is not here.
He is not here in this very moment. But in any case, we started to speak about China intensive in Middle East. He much more about China as about European Union, and then it's a reality. We have to be more active and to more with more innovative ideas. Gateway is a project now developed by European Union. We don't need, we have to make gateways here after 2015 here in Europe. So better to think to a project which is able to develop and to enforce this problematic, like it was presented by Dr. Alexandru Georgescu about infrastructures which are key for preserving the security of the countries, to link the countries, to enforce the network, to make a resilience from all these networks of railroads, of roads, and what we have here around in Europe. So please, who is interested to take the floor? Professor Nakshi, you have mentioned there some connections about north-south. Yes, it's interesting. If I'm not wrong, it was 6 years ago when it started the discussion. Dr. Alexandru Georgescu, maybe he is remembering when we published an article in Limes in Italy about the 3 Seas initiative, and we have the Danube Strategy going toward Black Sea. We have this 3 Seas initiative, but we have also this package of initiatives in the framework of Belt and Road. So a lot of initiatives, and we discovered that some of the projects could not be put in practice due to the lack of manpower. Money, you can find the money sometimes, but sometimes you don't have the manpower. So, and speaking about geopolitical axis, we have to look carefully about a new geopolitical axis developed by Russia. It seems the initiative of President Putin, Caspian Sea, Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea. So they introduce Caspian Sea in this framework. You remember that from Caspian Sea, it was an attack with missiles on from the ships from Caspian Sea in Syria. It was a transportation of military equipment over the rivers from Caspian Sea in the Black Sea and so on. So it's sensitive. Things are much more complicated. So please, who wants to take the floor? It was not mentioned the problematic of Ukraine and Turkey. Speaking about the Black Sea, it was not mentioned the North Atlantic Alliance, which is present here. Oh yeah, sorry, I mentioned something about no. Something wrong? No, not yet. Okay. So in this respect, we have to take care about all these developments. We don't know exactly the Black Sea. We have here countries members of NATO, like Turkey, which is interested to go to also to join Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like it was mentioned at the very beginning of the conference by Minister Melishkanu, an important construction. We have the problematic of Ukraine, which is our neighbor, but also a country which is in a very difficult situation, and we hope to have a diplomatic solution in relations with Russia, and so on. So not only Middle East, it's also our region, which is quite complicated. And about the developments, we have seen presented by Dr. Alexander Georgescu with the maps of in Central Europe and southern part of Europe, eastern part of Mediterranean. We have not to forget that a lot of ideas are coming also from Chinese initiatives. China have control, if I'm not wrong, about 10% of the harbors in Mediterranean, and also they are interested to go further in Europe. We have to see which are the opportunities, which are the challenges, and this cooperation with China. So, please, silence.
So you can.
May I have an intervention, Mr. Mohsen?
A peaceful intervention, please.
Surely, of course. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, Mr. Mohsen, I think regarding the EU relation and MENA countries, I think as many participants from early morning till now emphasize the importance of energy. As you know, EU and European countries, if they would like sufficient or let's say fundamental autonomy, they need to have good resources of energy. And as we know in last time, you know how is the challenges with the gas between Russia and European countries, especially some country in East. I remember 2 decades ago, when we discuss about some pipeline of energy between Iran and European countries, many people are emphasized such as the project are not feasible. But today, you know, you see or you feel the domination of Russia in sending or exporting energy, especially gas to EU. And because of the domination, they have the possibility to increase the price in 1 month 2 or 3 times. And EU has no any possibility to challenge such as difficulty. I think this is one important issue that we should work on that more. Another thing that EU relation and MENA country is generally when we are speaking or people, when they are speaking about the EU relation with MENA countries, they receive some voices from three important EU countries: Germany, France, Italy, and of course, before it was an UK. I think it is necessary to have more voices, more strong voices from other EU countries. EU has 27, 28 members, but generally the voices are concentrated in 2 or 3 or 4, 5 states. I think it is in the interest of countries like Romania, Poland, Hungary, to have more voices in EU regarding the relation of EU with many countries, especially Iran, that has have a very strong and close relation with new EU member country. You know, all of you knows very well the relation between Iran and Romania in '88 was more or reached more than 1 billion euros. That means there are a good capacity, but now we are feeling coming up, down, such as things, because our potential, I think it is necessary to work more on such as things, because such as cooperation between Romania and country in the Central and Eastern Europe is in interest of our nation and will be benefit in the process of development of trade and of course in all different sectors. And regarding the Black Sea, we know this is a very important issue. All of us, we know from beginning of third millennium, US began a special program to have significant presence in the Black Sea, and now we see a very, let's say, high competition between the country behind the Black Sea as having more military capacity in this important region. I think it is very important, and we have the possibility to cooperate in this manner between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea in the field of energy transit and combating terrorism and migration. Thank you again for attention, your kind attention.
Thank you. So we are now before the last session, and it's quite a short one, and I give the floor to my colleague, President Flavius Cavamaria. Please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Before starting the last session, I would like to introduce the last session, of course, because at the beginning we started talking about JCPOA and sanctions, and we have at an opening remark session, His Excellency Dr. Sayed Hossein Sedab Meidani is a member of Iranian nuclear team, and he is based currently in Vienna, working on this very special dossier. And now we have another three remarkable Iranian experts on JCPOA and sanctions regime. So that we like to have this kind of session as the last one in order to conclude the whole hour events today. We have three Iranian remarkable, as I already said, on this issue. I would like to give the floor currently my colleague Julian Mares to chair this panel. So the last panel will be only as the thoughts of Iranian side to make up clear what's going on in the next couple of months, or what will be the perspective of the whole situation on this dossier. Thank you very much. Mr. Mares, you have the floor.
Thank you, Flavius, for the kind introduction. The last panel is dedicated to one particular topic, the assessment of the economic sanctions on MENA's countries and innovative instruments for training. The last part is very challenging, I think. I will start introducing our distinguished guests, distinguished speakers, and then I will say a couple of words with respect to the topic. First of all, we will have here on the floor Professor Fouad Izadi. He's an expert on JCPOA issue from the Tehran University. Professor Mohsen Abdullahi, expert on international and environmental law from Shahid Beheshti University, Iran. Also, Radu Mushatescu, do we have him here with us?
Not yet, maybe a little bit later.
Okay. Last but not the least, Professor Pouria Askari, also an expert on public international law and investment arbitration from Alameh Tabatabai University of Iran. I think in advance to all the speakers, also the topic is challenging because we all know we are aware of the recent evolutions concerning the JCPOA. In short, in brief, the negotiations are expected to resume in order to get the United States to re-enter the deal. And that's the challenging perspective we have ahead of us. From this point of view, many officials across the European capitals are examining how to revive this EU-Iran trade following the lifting of the US secondary sanctions. So our question is, how can the European Union interact in a beneficial way with Iran, which will lead obviously to a win-win situation and perhaps win-win strategy? Dear speakers, please, you have the floor. I will invite Professor Fouad Izadi.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And we also need to thank the organizers of the conference. I have about 10 minutes, and I'm going to divide that into three pieces. First, I'm going to talk about sanctions. Second, I'm going to talk about what the new Raisi administration is doing about sanctions. And the third, I'm going to talk about the ongoing JCPOA talks in Vienna. With regard to sanctions, as you know, they are illegal under international law. The sanctions that are causing difficulties for Iran are sanctions that are dictated by the US Congress. And the dictate is that no country, European or non-European, should be engaging with Iran in a serious manner when it comes to international trade. And they're illegal because they violate the very principle of sovereignty in international law. Countries are sovereign. The United States can dictate to American companies what to do or what not to do, but they are not permitted under international law to impose their congressional laws on other countries. And in the past, we have had in the EU blocking statutes. In the 90s, the European countries decided to actually fight back when it came to this type of imposition on their sovereignty. And they basically told their countries' companies that if you follow what the US is telling you, you're going to pay a cost. That blocking statute program was not very successful. One reason was because European companies realized that the punishment from the United States is going to be more painful than the punishment from European countries and their countries. That was one problem. And the second problem, I believe, was that some of the European countries, at least, lost interest in imposing or implementing these blocking statutes, and they gave waivers a lot, and at the end of the day, they just went away. So Iran has been under sanctions for the last 40 years, more than 40 years. And the country has learned to live with sanctions. The sanctions are causing a lot of difficulties for ordinary citizens in Iran, especially the poorer segments of society. But the country has learned to adapt, and they are using sanctions to do some good things. For example, becoming independent in areas of science and technology is one result of the sanctions, because they cannot go to a European country and buy whatever they need. They need to build it internally, and that requires science, that requires technology, and they have to do that internally. So although the sanctions are causing difficulties for Iran, there are some positive side effects as well. That's the first part of my talk. The second part, with regard to the Raisi administration, they basically talked about Mr. Raisi and his people, talked about the fact that they didn't like what Rouhani was doing. And the basic idea was putting all Iran's eggs in the basket of the nuclear talks. Raisi decided was not a good idea. And the basic idea was to diversify and not wait for the result of these sanctions. So they are trying to work more with Iran's neighbors. The Raisi administration joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization just a few weeks ago, working more with China, working more with Russia, working more with countries that like to work with Iran is going to be an objective of Mr. Raisi. And in this line of thinking, the Raisi administration is looking forward to bilateral relations with European countries. So they have realized that basically relying on 2 or 3 European countries to resolve the difficulties that exist is not a successful idea. Talking to individual European countries is going to be done more in the Raisi administration, as far as I know. And you might have noticed that Mr. Bagheri Kani, who is Iran's deputy foreign minister for politics, visited 3 European capitals recently, last couple of weeks ago. And it was Germany, it was France, it was UK, and also Spain. Why did he go to Spain? The basic idea was that we want to move beyond this idea of just waiting for 2 or 3 countries, and they like to do bilateral relations. And I think Romania is going to be a country that they like to work more with, given the fact that the relations between the two countries have been positive in the last number of decades. So that's what the Raisi government is doing. They are trying to run the government in a manner that doesn't depend on oil sales. So if you look at the next year's budget in Iran, they are building an infrastructure that doesn't depend on sanctions being lifted. So the assumption here is that sanctions are going to be there. And this is not a very wrong assumption, because as you know, we had the United States saying that Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon. And then after JCPOA was signed, they started coming up with other excuses. And in the last number of months, they are talking about Iranian drones, which are generally devices that are defensive in nature. And the countries use drones to monitor their borders and other things. And no one in the defense community considers drones to be a weapon of mass destruction. So a lot of people in Iran realize that no matter what Iran does, the United States comes up with another excuse and another excuse to continue the sanctions. And they talk about it. They say that we need leverage. So no matter how much you give in, the conclusion here is that no matter how much you give in, since the United States wants to have leverage, they come up with other excuses to keep the sanctions on Iran as much as they can. And the third part of my talk is going to deal with what's going on in Vienna. As you might have heard, Iran has given two proposals, one on what Iran is going to do with its nuclear program under JCPOA, and what Iran expects the other side to do when it comes to lifting of sanctions. And the basic argument that Iran has is that Iran is willing and able to follow the nuclear agreement the way it was before Mr. Trump left it. And as you know, Iran stayed within the nuclear agreement about a year after President Trump left the agreement. The idea at that time was that they wanted to give the European countries some time to see if they can fix it, and obviously they couldn't. So Iran is able to go back to the nuclear agreement. There's no problem. There's no opposition inside the country when it comes to that issue. But Iran wants to make sure that the same thing that happened before, it doesn't happen again. There's this American saying that if you fooled me once, shame on you. If you fooled me twice, shame on me. And people in the Raisi administration are not fools. So they don't want to be in a position of repeating some of the mistakes that they consider happened during the Rouhani administration. And the basic idea is that the cost of and the risk of dealing with the United States is just too high. You know, in US, some of you may know, there is this credit score that people have. If you have good credit, if you pay your bills on time, you have a high credit score. If you don't pay your bills, if you engage in transactions that you don't follow with, your credit score is low. If the United States government were going to be graded on a credit score, the credit score of the United States government would be very low, because as we speak, we have the people in the US Congress, the Republicans, saying that they will destroy whatever Biden decides to do in Vienna. And we have, in the polls in the United States, Trump is actually more popular now than President Trump is. So we don't know what's going to happen in 2024. We don't know what's going to happen in 2022 with the US elections. So there are a lot of difficulties when it comes to dealing with the United States, because the US is becoming a banana republic, it seems. And dealing with a banana republic is going to be difficult for Iran or Europe or other parts of the world. And because of that reason, when somebody's credit score is low, they're going to pay a price. And what the Iranian side is saying is that they need to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen again. They don't want to go back and forth in the manner that we have experienced in the past. And what the European countries can do is actually follow the logic that Iran is presenting. Some of the statements that are coming from E3, UK, France, and Germany is not really positive. The fact that the UK foreign minister writes a joint article with the Israeli foreign minister right before the talks start is not a positive sign. The Israelis seem to be the military wing of these three European countries. Whatever they cannot get at the negotiating table, they get the Israelis to destroy and kill Iranian scientists. So when you have a situation like that, things don't look very good. The Biden administration says they want to go back to the nuclear agreement, but if they really wanted to go back, they could do it on the first day of Biden's presidency, the same way that he returned to the Paris Accords. He could go back to the nuclear agreement. Nuclear agreement was, the US left the nuclear agreement because of executive order that Trump signed, and Biden could just sign another executive order. And the reason they didn't do that is because it seems the US has moved beyond the nuclear agreement. This is not an analysis. This is what people like Wendy Sherman, who is the Deputy Secretary of State, is saying, that 2021 is not 2015. So it seems that the US government has moved away, and they talk about it if you pay attention. They say that they want to have an agreement that's longer and stronger. By longer, they mean that they want to change some of the articles of the nuclear agreement. As you know, some of the restrictions on Iran is going to finish in 8 years or 10 years or 15 years. They want to make those articles go longer. And this is what they mean by wanting to have a longer agreement. And a stronger, they mean they want to get concessions out of Iran beyond the nuclear issue. And as you may remember, the country's leader, Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, during the negotiations, mentioned this a couple of times, that if the negotiations on the nuclear issue go well, Iran may consider talking about other issues that exist. But we know that the nuclear issue did not go well. The Trump administration left it. So it's not very logical for Iran to give more concessions on other issues when the previous concessions have not resulted in much benefit for Iran. And there's going to be a price that the Raisi administration is going to pay internally with internal politics, because it's going to be a political suicide for a politician to just fall for the same rhetoric that existed before. And so the Raisi administration is going to think twice before accepting ideas that have been tested before. So these are some of the difficulties that exist in Vienna. I think the Iranian delegation is negotiating in good faith. It is in the interest of the Raisi administration to get sanctions relief. Mr. Raisi has promised different things during the campaign. He does need sanctions relief to be able to deliver on some of these promises, but they are not going to accept ideas and restrictions and things like longer and stronger rhetoric because of the past experience. I think my time is up. It's raining in Tehran because of the drought. We get happy when we get rain in Tehran. So I'm going to go and take a walk after the conference. It's about 8 o'clock p.m. And thank you again for the invitation. I hope that you engage in this type of activities more as we progress.
Dear Professor Izadi, please, I would like to keep you for 2 more minutes. And please allow a question.
Yes.
You said
yes.
that the Iranian economy has accommodated itself with the sanctions, and the people have used with the sanctions. Please, I'm interested in understanding if lifting the sanctions is a real stake for Iran. So please, can you tell us what happens actually within the Iranian economy if the sanctions are lifted? What will happen?
Well, if the sanctions are lifted, Iran is supposed to be able to sell more oil. You know, Iran is selling more than 1 million barrels of oil as we speak. So the oil sales under the current condition is actually much better than what we had a few months ago. And that's why the Raisi administration believes that they can continue with the current situation. That's why they are not going to accept unreasonable proposals from the other side, because the country is used to sanctions. The country knows how to go around sanctions. The country knows that when you give too much concessions, you don't get much out of it. And so the value of JCPOA is not as great as it was before, because Iran has this experience that the Americans promise things, and once they get an agreement, they don't follow through with their promises, and they cause difficulties. And they're being difficult people. Obviously, as I said, the Raisi administration likes to get sanctions relief. But if talks in Vienna don't work, is that they can manage the country for many years to come in the manner that they're managing. The policy of maximum pressure campaign has failed. The idea was to overthrow the Iranian government during the Trump administration. That didn't happen. The idea was to have the Iranian economy collapse. That didn't happen. And when you have failed policies, the current administration has this choice in Washington, whether to continue the failed policies of the past or realize that they have failed and change course. And it's up to them. And I'm going to stay with you until the end of the session. So I'll be around.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. And enjoy the rain afterwards.
I'll do that.
Now I will invite Mr. Professor Mohsen Abdullahi to deliver his speech, his presentation. Thank you.
Hello. Do you have me?
Hello. Yes.
Hello and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear all professors, Mr. Chairman. Before starting, I would like to appreciate MEPEI and IPIS for holding and founding this conference. By the topic, implication of economic sanction on the implementation of environmental commitments, I would like to show you that whether the economic sanctions have negative effects on the international environmental obligations and how such unintended implications of sanctions should be addressed. I will discuss this topic in three following sections. First, economic sanctions, 1 mean and 2 1 mean and 2 application. Section 2, how sanction undermine the environmental agreements. And finally, the need for environmental exemptions in any sanction regime. Let's start with section 1, sanction, economic sanction, 1 mean and 2 application. Regardless of the legitimacy of the sanctions, the economic sanction may be observed from 2 divergent points of view. First, economic sanction as economic sanctions as a tool against non-cooperative states. And second, economic sanctions as a bar to meet the goals of environmental agreements. I will jump to second point of view. The economic sanctions can become key obstacles to meet global climate goals. the unintended consequences of the accumulating sanctions can prevent the meeting of the global climate goals, leading to devastating environmental impacts. Most of the environmental agreements set up international financial obligations and mechanisms such as technical and financial assistance, transfer of technology, joint implementation, and trade emission, and finally, clean development mechanism. It is obvious that the economic sanctions are fundamentally contrary to these obligations, and these obligations have been frequently reiterated in the majority of international agreements. In section 2 and next slides, I will try to show you that how sanctions undermine the regime of climate change and international environmental agreements. Economic sanctions weaken the implementation of salient international policies and measures by three following ways: isolation and non-participation in international environmental agreements, leading the targeted countries to unsustainable survivalist policy, and reduction of the capacity for compliance in targeted countries. First, the international environmental agreements offer a number of principles and mechanisms to build confidence and help to encourage the participation of developing countries in the instruments of environmental protection. The principles like common but differentiated responsibility and mechanisms like clean development mechanism, transfer of technology, and providing technical and financial resources to developing countries. The vast number of parties to Montreal Protocol, UNFCCC, and Kyoto Protocol proves the widespread global support for these mechanisms. However, the participation of the sanction-targeted countries in the environmental agreements, including Paris Agreement, is low. The study of the practice of nations under the UN sanctions shows that these states were anxious about the Paris Agreement, as among the 13 UN sanctioned states, 5 states have not ratified the Paris Agreement, and in their intended nationally determined contribution, INDC, Iran, Sudan, and Somalia mentioned their economic sanction as a bar to attaining the financial sources and the required technologies for successful implementation of their INDCs. Forced to say that Libya, as an exception to African states, did not disseminate its INDC at all. Among the above-mentioned states, the case of Iran is unique. Iran, after 6 UN Security Council resolutions which imposed a very strict regime of economic sanction for restricting sensitive part of Iran nuclear activities, agreed joint to JCPOA, so-called nuclear deal, with the 5 permanent member of UN Security Council plus Germany on July 2015. Simultaneously, Iran submitted its INDC on November 2015 and signed the Paris Agreement on April 2016. Iran's INDC declared its unconditional intention to participate by mitigating its greenhouse gas emission into 2030 by 4% compared to business as usual scenario, BAU. In addition to its unconditional mitigation action, Iran, in the light of existence of unjust sanctions, availability of international resource in the form of financial support and technology transfer, exchange of carbon credits, accessibility of bilateral and multilateral implementation mechanism, transfer of clean technology, as well as capacity building, the Islamic Republic of Iran has the potential of mitigating additional greenhouse gas emission up to 8% against the BAU scenario, that is to say 12% in total. While the cabinet of the minister and the parliament in Iran had approved the Paris Agreement in November 2016, the Guardian Council, which constitutionally holds the veto power over all legislation approved by the parliament or Majlis, did not ratify agreement. There are 2 main reasons which may unofficially explain Iran's Guardian Council objection. First, the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and JCPOA, And second, the reimposition of the UN suspended sanction has put Iran's economy in the worst economic situation it has ever seen. The widespread nature of the sanctions have severely limited the availability of economic sources needed for climate action in Iran. In the aftermath of the renewed sanctions, several companies, including large EU companies, left Iran's market, thereby worsening the economic situation in Iran. Given the situation, there is no guarantee that Iran could comply with its commitments under the Paris Agreement. Economic sanctions against Iran have isolated the country and its ability to meet its obligation under international climate change regime. Second, leading the targeted countries to unsustainable survivalist policy. Economic sanctions generally target daily and economic basic needs of the population of the targeted states. In short run, targeted country may resort to survivalist mechanism to avoid sanction impacts. Iran is an example in this regard. Again, while Iran's daily consumption of gasoline was more than 62 million liters during past UN sanctions time, 2006 to 2013, the US and EU sanctioned the gasoline supply to Iran. As a result, to secure its energy supply, Iran has turned petrochemical factories into oil refineries and produced petrochemical gasoline. In other words, the sanction forced Iran to be creative and to be compromise its environment quality. Iran's homegrown petrol contained 10 times the level of contaminants found in imported fuel. And the sulfur content of its domestically produced diesel is 800 times higher than that of international standard. And third, reduction of capacity of compliance in targeted countries. In order to reduce emission, environmental convention commit their parties to use the best technology or to the consumption of alternative green materials whose production requires the latest knowledge and technology. For the most part, the developing countries do not have access to such technology. Therefore, for most part, the developing countries do not have access to such technology. Therefore, their compliance would depend on technology development and or transfer of technology from developed parties of the convention. It is clear that sanctions are a strong bar against any transfer of technology to developing parties of environmental agreements, and therefore the sanctions decrease the affected developing country from reaching their capacity for compliance. This can explain why sanctioned targeted states parties to Kyoto Protocol have conditioned their vast part of their mitigation action under Paris Agreement to the non-existence of sanctions, availability of international resources in the form of financial support, and effective technology transfer. Let's have a look to CDM project's story. Economic sanctions have already affected the developing targeted states interested in Kyoto Protocol CDM project, Clean Development Mechanism projects. As this figure demonstrates, a number of the registered CDM projects of targeted states have been aborted due to the economic sanctions. Sometimes the figures and numbers are telling without any more explanation. You can see here that Iran has had 22 registered CDM projects before UN sanction, before 2006. And you can see that how just one of these projects could get certification from the UNFCCC Secretariat. And the case is similar for other countries which were or are under the UN sanction, that this can explain that how the sanctions, deprive these countries from their rights to benefit from CDM projects under the International Convention, I mean that UNFCCC. And the final section, the need for environmental exemption in any sanction regime. A study of environmental situation of the targeted countries has shown that imposition of sanction carries significant unintended consequences for environmental policies of these countries and their capacity for compliance with their environmental obligations. I suggest that the idea of environmental exemptions could protect the world's environmental policies and measures from unintended implications of international sanctions. The exemptions of the United Nations Security Council sanctions regime are not unprecedented. These exemptions are necessary for the effectiveness and legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council resolution. To avoid these implications of economic sanctions, the UN bodies and all the states are called to consider such implications in the former and any future regime of sanctions. The concept of environmental exemptions may be developed based on two main approaches. First, by accepting a new exception to sanction regimes similar to humanitarian exemptions. This approach is preferred as it could give an independent legal status and more weight to environmental consideration. And second approach is to include the environmental exemption into the consolidated notion of humanitarian exemptions. The relationship between human rights and environmental law, as well as established notion, thus this inclusion have sufficient theoretical foundations. The development of the notion of environmental exemptions, either as a new exemptions or as a part of humanitarian exemptions, may assist in the future development of international law. Extension of such exemptions into the unilateral regime of sanction is necessary for extensive protection of the Earth's environment and its climate system. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you for your speech and presentation. From the audience, I have a question to deliver. Namely, the people who are watching us are interested to know your opinion on the way is regarded among the Iranian policymakers and academics the real purpose of the nuclear issue. Is it containing the Iranian regional ambitions and its influence in countries like Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon, or is otherwise? Please, if you could answer this question for the audience.
The question is for me?
Yes.
Actually,
yes,
I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm sure that Iran has inherent right to use and benefit from peaceful nuclear technology. And this is why Iran is part of the nuclear treaty in 1968, non-proliferation treaty. Therefore, if you look at all the reports of the IAEA, no sign you can find that this report says that Iran is developing a nuclear bomb or any doubtful activities. Therefore, I think that Iran, like any other country in the world, have rights to benefit from the nuclear technology. And this is, and especially my presentation shows that Iran needs new energy and clean energy. And nuclear, energy, and especially electricity from nuclear resource is Iran need, and we should benefit from this technology as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the reply. Perhaps Professor Izadi has something on this. If not, we can move further. How you like.
I can, since your time is running out, I just add a couple of sentences that, you know, the issue of Iran's nuclear program is started in 2002.
Okay.
Iran has been under sanctions since 1979. So there's a problem there. So even without Iran's nuclear program, we have the United States and unfortunately some European countries that just like Iran. And the problem they have is with the nature of the government, it seems. And so the Americans were kicked out of Iran in 1979. The dictator that the United States supported was overthrown. And the Americans get upset when the dictators that they support get overthrown. And that's the basic that's the basic problem that exists. If, you know, tomorrow Iran does what Libya did and just give up the whole nuclear program altogether, put it in a ship and send it to Virginia in the United States, the way Gaddafi did that. Would that resolve problems? No. The other side will find other excuses to sanction.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Askari, would you please have the floor?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Maresh. Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy and privileged to be present in this very interesting conference. I was really enjoying the presentations by my colleagues from Iran and also from Romania and abroad. So once again, thank you so much. My presentation today is actually about the US sanctions on Iran and their impacts on the EU-Iran trade relationship. So generally speaking, maybe as an introduction, I have to say Iran and different European countries are traditional trade partners. So we used to have trade relations, and this situation for the moment is halted, especially because of the US sanctions. So this is the reason I think it is important in this conference that we are talking about different EU challenges and relationships to talk also about the problem that now we have for extending our trade relationship between Iran and also different European states. So to start, maybe if you let me, I want to have a very short introduction on the difference between the United Nations sanctions and the so-called United States sanctions. As mentioned by my colleagues, and as you all know it very well, when the JCPOA was concluded a couple of years ago, in principle, the United Nations Security Council terminated all its sanctions against Iran. So at the moment that now we are talking, Iran is not under any kind of sanctions regime imposed by the international community or the United Nations Security Council. So when we are talking about US sanctions, in principle, we are talking about unilateral coercive measures and not sanctions, which are in principle very different. Because when we are talking about sanctions by the United Nations Security Council, we are talking about a kind of, let's say, punishment decided by the international community in accordance with the UN Charter against one of the member states. But when we are talking about UCMs or the unilateral coercive measures, in principle, we are talking about a unilateral act by one of the states who decided to make changes because of its own foreign policy against another state or states. So this is something very important. At the moment, Iran is not under any kind of sanctions imposed by the international community. The second thing that I want to say as an introduction is, generally speaking, when we are talking about United States unilateral coercive measures, we are talking about two kind of different regimes. The first is the ones that we call as primary sanctions. And those are sanctions which, in fact, the US is imposing on US citizens and US companies who want to have trade relationship or any kind of, let's say, relationship with Iran, which unfortunately also in some areas it is very disappointing. Let's say like academic areas, we can see that now there are heavy pressure and severe pressure by the US administration against US academic centers that they do not have the permission to work with their Iranian counterparts. So these are the primary sanctions, which generally speaking are the decision of the United States administration to control its own entities, to not have any kind of deal or relationship with Iran. But this is not the end of the story. The difficulty is, apart from the primary sanctions, we also have the so-called secondary sanctions, which are the challenging part of the United States sanctions against Iran or any other country under the sanction regimes of the United States. Secondary sanctions are in fact not against the targeted state, not against the American companies or the American citizens, but they are generally against all the partners, trade partners or economic partners or investment partners of the targeted country. So in principle, when we are talking about US sanctions against Iran, we do not mean that these sanctions or unilateral coercive measures are merely against Iran, but they are against Iran and all its partners, including all the European countries and all the European companies and all the European citizens who may want to have some trade relationships with Iran. So here we are talking about the kind of dilemma that we have in the international legal order and also in generally speaking international relations. There is a hegemon power which is imposing its power and its sanctions against everyone because it wants to punish one very specific state, and in our case study, Iran. So if we say that, legally speaking, that these sanctions are illegal, I would say here at least we can talk about 3 different reasons. So the first reason, when it comes to the unilateral coercive measures by the United States against Iran, the first reason that we can easily say that these are illegal, as mentioned by Professor Izadi, is because United Nations Security Council in its resolution 2231 under Chapter 7 clearly obliged all the international community, including the United States, to not interfere in the good implementation of the JCPOA. The resolution 2231 endorsed the JCPOA and asked the international community to do whatever they can to make sure that it is fully implemented. I mean, the JCPOA. So it is very clear that the the United States sanctions are seriously affecting the full implementation of both the JCPOA and the resolution adopted by all the members of the United Nations Security Council. So this is the first very clear reason that we can easily say that all of these unilateral coercive measures are illegal. But apart from that, there are at least 2 other very important legal reasons that we can use to say that the sanctions are not legitimate. The second one is, as mentioned by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the sanctions or unilateral coercive measures on human rights, the United States imposed sanctions are severely affecting the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life and the right to health, especially in this very specific time that all of us in this planet are fighting with the coronavirus And you can imagine that in a situation like this, we have a very difficult problem because actually the sanctions are there and it is difficult for the Iranian government, whatever is the government, it was the Rouhani government or now the Raisi government, it is very difficult for the Iranian government to fulfill its obligation under different international treaties, international human rights treaties in regards to right to health. I mean, to provide medicine and to provide what is necessary to fight against the coronavirus. So when the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights is saying that at least in this very specific moment, we have to revise the sanctions, the reason is actually the sanctions are heavily affecting the people and not the politicians or let's say the system. And apart from that, we have different principles of international law that the sanctions and especially the secondary sanctions or the secondary extraterritorially applicable regulations of the United States are really affecting. These include the principle of sovereignty, as mentioned, and also the principle of non-intervention, which clearly is saying the states as sovereign states have the right, have the inherent right to decide for their own what they want to do in their domestic affairs and also in their foreign affairs. But the secondary sanctions are severely affecting this right of different states, including the European states, when they want to decide about their foreign relationship and about their trade partners. And this is the reason that, as mentioned a couple of years ago, the European states finally decided to do something with this, because in principle, the US is imposing its own will against all the partners of the target state, and in our case, Iran. So the European countries decided to adopt the blocking regulations or the blocking statute to do something. This means that at least they want to encourage the European companies and the European entities to not comply with the extraterritorial rules and regulations of the United States. But unfortunately, this is not working. And the reason is the fines which are actually foreseen in the European blocking regulations are not comparable at all to the fines and different punishments that the United States Congress has decided to impose on those who are breaking or violating the extraterritorial regulations of the United States. So as a result, it is very interesting. In the latest report of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the unilateral coercive measures, she mentioned that we see that the European companies are not just complying, but in many cases, what we see is a kind of over-compliance. This means that they are trying to do more to make sure there is no sentence against them by the United States. So this is the situation that we have now, and this is the reason we do not have a good relationship, trade relationship, I mean, between the European different European states and Iran at the moment. But as we all know, now the talks are going on in Vienna. The JCPOA participants are there, Iran is there, and the US, which is not a JCPOA participant at the moment, is also there. And we don't know what will happen. There are lots of challenges, but let's assume that at least as a presumption, there is a possibility that the sanctions are again lifted. And so in general, there is a possibility for the European companies and also for the European different entities to reestablish their trade relationship and economic partnership with Iran. But the difficulty is actually at this very specific moment, what we are hearing from the Washington and from the US Congress is whatever the Biden administration do, we will reverse it whenever we come back. So when the next President Trump comes, again, we will withdraw from the JCPOA, and this means that the sanctions will be back. So of course, if we just think that how the managers of different European investment companies or trade companies are thinking, they say that, well, okay, maybe this time they leave the sanctions, but again, it is on a temporal basis, and very soon we will have again the sanctions are back by the next US administration. So here is the difficulty, and this is the last point that I want to mention. If the European countries, if the EU really wants to reestablish the relationship with Iran when it comes to trade, investment, and economy, this is the momentum. Now the European states are there. I mean, the E3 are there, and of course the representative, the high representative of the European Union is also there in Vienna, negotiating with Iran, with Russia, with China, and also with the United States. And it is very important to use this momentum to find a way to push the current US administration to find a strategy to make sure that the next US administration will not do what President Trump did, because this is really the key. Without this guarantee, without this, let's say, a kind of assurance, no one can really easily think of reestablishing trade relationship. And this is very important. And this is why Iran is really talking about this, that we cannot trust what the Americans are doing. Because at the moment, okay, we know that at least they are saying that we want to lift the sanctions, but we don't know what will happen in 2022 and afterwards in 2024 after the US presidential elections. And it is very important. So apart from that, there is also a second point that I think it is very crucial for the European states, and that is to really revise the blocking regulations. As I have mentioned, these regulations are not working, and this is not what I am stating. This is what the European authorities also have mentioned, and it is also mentioned in the reports of the United Nations, that at the end of the day, when the European companies are forced to take a decision, they go for the punishment by their own government in accordance with the blocking statute and the blocking regulations, because they are highly weaker than the punishments that they will face if they break and violate the US extraterritorial regulations. So as a conclusion, what I want to say is, if we are talking about an action from the European side, it is not because of Iran. It is first of all because of the independence of the European states against this hegemon power, which is using its hegemon currency against all the states. It is now imposing sanctions against Iran, against Venezuela, against Cuba, against many others. And very soon, you will have to take a very important decision, US or China, and that is not easy. So I think this is the momentum that I think it is good that we can talk about it, what the European countries can do to really confront with this, let's say, threat against their own independence. Thank you very much, Mr. Marish.
We thank you, dear Professor Askari. We could see that your speech came from the heart, and also implicitly it provided an answer at full length to the previous question. We are running out of time. We need to go to the final session of our event. I will give the floor back to Flavius and to Mr. Mureșan. I thank you all. You had wonderful contributions, and we are grateful for having you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it was a marathon of 10 hours without breaks and so on, but we succeed to come to the top of the discussion about MENA, and MENA now, MENA history of MENA now, and in the vision. So the concluding discussion, concluding remarks, not concluding, final remarks. I had from the very beginning, I was very pleased together with Flavio that General Pivariu have accepted to take in also General Branco if he succeed to survive, also other colleagues which want to have very short interventions. We are trying to pick up the most interesting and challenging ideas for preparing a paper in this respect. So, who wants to take the floor? General Pivariu. I have seen you. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, distinguished audience, it was a pleasure and a privilege for me to attend this conference and to listen to analysis of internationally and regionally well-known and recognized personality on the issue concerning the Middle East and North Africa. I have a special remark for the excellent presentation of Dr. Adrian Severin. Listening to the honorable speakers, I may draw the following main conclusion. MENA first remain an extremely complex area which will go on playing an important role in the coming geopolitical developments. The off-balance of situation confronting MENA today is also due to the conflict generated by globalization, to the power struggle aimed at resettling the international relation on new basis, or resorting on an often used term to the Great Reset. 10 years after the Arab Spring was triggered, the area is still impaired by the events that were set off and that time is impacted by their consequences, not all of them positive, and which led either to regional intervention, to counter-revolution and civil war. A certain lessening of the US focus on the area led to the destabilization and to strengthening the presence of other international stakeholders. Direct negotiation between the parties involved in different conflicts represent a positive factor, and even whatever they may or may not reach results, they must be continued. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries continue to have an ever important role in finding a stability solution in the Middle East. The normalization of the tie with Israel go forward, taking timid steps, and is still far from coming to an end, and so is the case with the Palestinian problem. Iran continued to lead the so-called axis of resistance, which include numerous non-state actors from the Lebanese Hezbollah to Houthi rebels and Assad Syria. Iran is an unavoidable player. Starting with 2015, Russia strengthened its presence and influence in the area, taking advantage not only of the US decision not decisively getting involved in Syria, but also of the rivalry among Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Nevertheless, Russia did not get a greater influence on other conflicts in the Middle East, such as the Yemeni one or the Israeli-Palestinian one. Yet Russia improved its relation with the Gulf country and Israel. China constantly improved its position in the Middle East and will probably choose to be a more visible presence in solving the regional conflicts. Under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan lead, Turkey became, during the last decade, an ever important force on the international arena, including in military terms. Its position may be weakened by the economic difficulty it is confronted with. A mediation aimed at stability and development in MENA is necessary and may be possible. The form of such a mediation should be agreed upon by all parties involved and interested. I suggest that the papers presented and published to be published in a separate volume or included in the next issue of MEPEI magazine. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Professor Adrian Severin, coming back from the classes to join our final discussion. And also I invite also other colleagues which express their interest to have also some contribution for the final remarks. Professor Adrian Severin, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I think that Mr. Pivario made a very good sum up of these talks, of these contributions of today, of the debate of today. I wouldn't dare to try the same exercise. I must say that I covered, I followed the most of the discussions, even if when I was not present on the screen, I was listening on my phone, wherever I was, and I was impressed by the convergence of our opinions. I noticed few disagreements, but quite marginal and on the details. But when put together, all interventions, they very much converged to the same possible conclusions. And this is impressive, mainly since we had in presence, we had in the debate people coming from various countries, from various continents, with various backgrounds, with various personal experiences. So this is indeed very indicative on the fact that perhaps we can understand the realities, we can define the realities, we can establish the right diagnosis, we can formulate the right questions, and we can even give the right answers to the right questions. The problem is somewhere where the political, say, wish, the political will, the political inclinations, and perhaps the political traditions are leading things in the wrong direction. I think that one major problem I have identified while listening the debates said that it consists in that in the militarization, ideologization, and unilateralizations of the international relation. This is one major problem of today. And I believe that this problem has its roots in the fact that we are living in a time when some powers are fading, some powers are obsolete or tired, or they have reached their historical limits, while others are rising. And when a new power, a new actor is showing up, the old actors are very unhappy. And when an old actor should cease claiming some rights and privileges linked to its former leadership, again, we have some problems. So I would end by, calling, and this was inspired by the last session very much, by calling a formula which we are hearing again and again these days, the international relations based on rules. And I think that this formula, international relations based on rules, is something else than the international law. Because the international law, as we know it, is the result of an international consensus, while the international order based on rules, it's some of unilateral decision. It's an expression of unilateralism. The rules are not established consensually, but they are established by some states which still believes that they can impose their rules and their visions on the whole world. And there we have indeed a problem. How can we go back to the international law? And this is my last remark, concluding remark, if I could call it like that. Well, the international law as we know it was, by the biggest part of it, created during the Cold War, the Cold War. So it reflected the bipolarism of the international order. It reflected some realities. It was, to my mind, a very well thought international law, but to a certain extent, it is obsolete. So what we have to do is not to replace an obsolete international law by a unilateral set of rules established by those who still believe that they can impose their vision on the whole world, but we have to go back to the multilateralism, to the broad debate of all actors or all relevant and willing to act actors in the world, and try to establish a consensual set of rules in which would allow us to live peacefully together in security and stability. So more or less, this is something which was inspired, some ideas inspired to me by listening to most of the debates of the intervention. And indeed, even if to a certain point, Mr. Mureșan, I was afraid that somebody would say that you have breached the International Convention Against Torture by keeping us, to stay for 10 long hours and listen to so very deep debates, enriching, full of information. But well, the quality of the intervention would excuse you, and certainly you could defend yourself by making reference to these contributions, which were indeed enriching. And I congratulate you and Mr. Cavamaria for this excellent idea and excellent achievement. Thank you very much, and all the best to all panelists and contributors.
It was a contribution of all the speakers, and regarding the torture, you have seen we have avoided to have breaks, because then we could be accused about waterboarding, drinking water during the breaks. So it was just pure torture about ideas, and without food for thought, just food for thought, not food and food security and so on, maybe in the future. So Carlos, if you want to say something, 1 minute, something.
Mr. Mureșan.
Yeah, please, so kindly, Ambassador, I was in contact with yes, Carlos, please.
Okay. Me or other people?
No, it was you, then Ambassador Charles, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, Mr. Flavius, I should continue or other people?
No, please, Your Excellency, please, yeah, you have the floor, and after that, General Carlos Branco, if you have something to add.
Okay, thank you very much again. I would like to emphasize the very close cooperation and fruitful working with Mr. Flavius to preparing such as conference that has some important improvement comparing with the last session. That's mean more participants from more countries, especially from Iran and IPIS. Of course, the simultaneity with the Romanian National Day is very important, and of course, the variety of subject and discussion. Of course, it was a variety and rich subject. I wouldn't like to mention again, but only I would mention the 3-4 points. First, the importance of increasing cooperation in delicate crises like Afghanistan. Second, the importance of deepening cognition and knowledge, I think is very important. The third is EU political and economic autonomy mainly depend on energy, and the MENA region is very, let's say, effective region, and the country in the region that has the possibility to make diversified resources, and especially gas and petrol from Iran. Of course, another point is it is very important to have significant voice from another EU country, not only from EU3. And regarding the JCPOA, I think it is very important to repeat that in 15 inspection report of the governor of Energy Atomic Agency, always they demonstrate and they report all Iranian commitment to the agreement and JCPOA. I think it is very important. And finally, I would like a short mention regarding the approach of the new government of Iran, who declared the priority of foreign policy first, close relation with the neighbors, regional balance and stability. And I think it is here very important for relation with European country that's expanding bilateral relation with all countries around the world. Again, I would like to express my thanks to all participants, the organizer, and because we are living in the pandemic era, I would express the best wishes of your health and success in your personal and familiar life. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. So, other participants who have to want to say 1 minute, something?
Yes, Liviu, I can say something. First of all, may I?
Yes, please.
Yes. Let me tell you, I am really impressed with this seminar. It's the first time I participate. And what really impressed me the wide variety of participants, the wide variety of perspectives, the wide variety of explanations for the events and perspective. This is the kind of debate we really need, just to go beyond certain narratives which are repeated ad nauseum. And in this conference, it was, let me tell you, it was really refreshing. Really refreshing. We have the opportunity to listen a couple of things we are not used to. And I could elaborate on many issues. I know that we are running short of time, but I just would like to tell you this. I completely join the intervention of Mr. Adrian Severin. I could repeat fully his intervention, and its approach, I'm really in line with him. The world needs multilateralism, and multilateralism. And if we go in other directions, we as a humanity are doomed to fail. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Liviu.
Thank you so much. Okay. In this very moment, I think we have to close the session. I just want to mention something I discovered recently. On YouTube, you can find an interview with Professor John Mearsheimer. Professor Mearsheimer, he was our guest 4 years before. We had conferences, we had discussions in special events we organized, exchange of ideas, also with discussion with the students. So John Mearsheimer has an interview on YouTube about America, China, and the tragedy of great power politics. And you will wonder how many interesting ideas you can find about these perceptions from this part of other part of the Atlantic about the international situation, security environment, how complicated it is, how challenging it is, and how we have to try by dialogue to work together and to fight, to bring again to the reality, to the surface, the two words, trust and truth. Without trust and truth, we cannot work in the future. We need to exchange ideas, and maybe this was a little bit challenging, long, but it was a proof that we need this exchange of ideas, and we are confident that sooner or later we will move again, we will meet again, and we will work again to interesting scientific papers, books, and important events. Together with Flavius, we wish you all the best health for you and your families, and we hope to see you soon.
Yeah,
Flavius.
Just one short conclusion. I would like also to thank you, hardly, I would like to thank you all, even though panelists and even though the attendee, all of us contribute to the success of this event. And the conclusion was very well drawn by Professor Severin, by Dr. Pivariu, also His Excellency Ekbalizark, and also the thoughts from our General Carlos Branco. I would like to thank also again our co-organizer, Eurodefense Romania, represented here by Professor Liviu Mureșan, and co-partner and our partner from Iran, the strong partner from Iran, IPIS, the Institute for Political and International Study belongs from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and of course, a huge special support offered by the Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran to Romania, especially offered by His Excellency Dr. Sayed Hossein Sadat Meidani. All these partners and supporters, organizers contribute to this event, a long marathon event. And of course, we benefit for the first time the presence of His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Hassan Sheikh Al-Islami, the new president of the Institute for Political and International Study and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, to have him to open our webinar. Related to the next conference, as I mentioned at the beginning, we reflect in order to have the next event physically in July, at the beginning of July 2022. Based on these 2 years experience, I think this digitalization and webinar and online event maybe learn us a lot in order to have a new one as a physical event. And related to our next events will be a series events related to the launching. Also, again, I will mention our book, The Geopolitics of Iran, that here we have also present here another co-editor, General Carlos Branco. And one of the contributors here is Professor Kihan Barzegar, who contribute a lot to the success of this book. So this will be next of our events.
Don't forget to mention the other ones.
No, I mentioned. I also mentioned at the beginning, if you like to be very correctly, the other co-editor is Professor Francisco Leandro from Macau. And among other contributors was present here, Professor Davut Chiani and Professor Rege Bedroza. So with all these things, I wish you, I think, a good evening, have a great evening and successful. And for the others, we are approaching to the Christmas, Happy New Year and winter time. So we wish you all the best and Happy New Year. Thank you very much.